To tell you that we're, as I mentioned, sorry, 16 billion US in global turnover, triple B rated company, 30% equity. Our history in the region of Eastern Africa goes back over 25 years. In Kenya, we built the Tika Dam. In the 90s, we were involved also in quite a bit of the reconstruction and rehabilitation works between Mombasa and Nairobi. One of the reasons for my gray hair was also the 5-year effort that I spent doing the Nairobi concession, Uhuru Highway, which, as people know, flopped at the end of the day. We talked about it earlier. We don't really know what we're supposed to talk about today during this seminar. So I'm here maybe just to share some lessons learned. If you're curious, a lot has already been said over the past day and a half, and the last thing I'm going to do is want to put you to sleep. So anyways. Hope that helps at least a little bit.
Catherine Kimario, Regional Director for PTA Bank. What does that mean? It means I actually cover 12 countries on the Eastern Seaboard as the representative, but I also cover 19 countries, again on the Eastern Seaboard, on the projects and infrastructure finance side of things. Briefly, what is PTA Bank? We are a regional development financial institution. For those of you who may be familiar with ADB, IFC, such likes. We are one such creature. We've been around for 30 years. You may not have heard of us because we tend to do our things quietly, try to get things done. We span, as I said, 19 countries from Egypt down to Zambia on the Eastern Seaboard. We have a couple of islands that we cover, both Mauritius and Seychelles. And we go inwards to DRC. In terms of the business that we do, we have about a $4 billion balance sheet. What this means is around $3.5 billion of investments, both on trade finance, structured trade, as well as project finance, which is, I guess, what we'll be talking more about today. On the transport side, we work, historically, we've worked with ports, with airports, as well as airlines. We've actually even worked with some shipping companies. We are open to doing business. Although we are a DFI, we provide commercially priced money, and this is on a risk basis. So we'll assess each transaction risk by risk and price accordingly. We also have a funds management business that we are looking to launch 2 funds. One is an equity fund, a COMESA infrastructure fund. Some of you may have heard about it. And the other one is actually a trade finance fund. I think I'll leave it there for now, and we'll be happy to interact.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ziad Sarang. I'm one of the managing directors at Fieldstone Africa. My claim to, I wouldn't say fame, but my reason for being here is that I have been involved in project financing, PPPs, on the African continent for all of my career, and that spans over 15 years. I was with Standard Bank for about 15 years, in which I had looked at many of the first PPPs on the continent, such as the first accommodation PPPs in South Africa under the PFMA. Looked at toll roads, refinancing of toll roads in South Africa, doing the first toll road outside of South Africa. That was the private sector toll road in Nigeria, the Lekki Concession Company. I worked 10 years ago with my fellow panelists on another potential toll road here in Kenya, and have had a very close association with the Kenyan project finance market as well. The firm I've joined now is called Fieldstone Africa. We have been on the continent for over 20 years. In fact, we celebrated our 20-year anniversary this year. We are a global investment bank without a balance sheet, so that makes us independent. We provide clear advice to clients that is non-conflicted, in the sense that we do what is best for our clients. our client list, in fact, offices-wise, we've biggest office is in Johannesburg, which is where I come from. We've got an office in London, New York, Malaysia, as well as in Washington representation. And over a month ago, we opened up our office in Nairobi. So we've got a local presence as well. The client list, in terms of what we do, we've got a very strong focus on energy. And last year we were rated #1 financial advisor in Africa, having closed over $2 billion worth of deals. The biggest one was in Nigeria, gas IPP called the Azura project, and that was a $900 million project. Interestingly, there we were financial advisor, leading 14 banks to financial close. So quite a feat indeed. Again, I haven't been briefed exactly on what to do, but I think what we can do is go through lessons learned in terms of our decades of experience in project finance across various jurisdictions, not just in Africa, but also outside of South Africa.
I want it to be an interactive session. If you have any question, you can ask the panelists and they can answer the question. So if you have a comment or something to say, it's a free session.
I'd like to ask Mr. Sarang, having led that 14 bank syndication in Nigeria, obviously that's a bigger market than here, but I doubt that their infrastructure is better than ours. What would your take home be for us in this space?
Given my experience, the single biggest risk that you have in these type of projects, where you have local currency revenue streams, is the local currency risk exposure, especially when it comes to doing large deals, as we just saw up on the board. I wouldn't. The project that we did in Nigeria last year was a dollar-based revenue stream and a dollar-based funding, so that one doesn't apply. But my experience in Nigeria with the Lekki concession, the toll road, where the tolls were collected in local currency, exactly in Naira. Our challenge there, we spent almost 3 years raising the local currency funding, and the reason why we did that was because there is nothing you can do to mitigate a currency mismatch. And as a financial advisor, I will tell you that. There is nothing you can do to mitigate a currency mismatch unless you have a hedging market. And in Nigeria, in 2000 and when we started the project in 2004, we closed it in 2008. There is no hedging market that goes out 14 years. You can run any model, any sensitivity, put in any type of buffers. You can put in reserve accounts. When the currency blows out and you've got local currency revenue and hard currency or foreign currency obligations, you go bankrupt. And a project company cannot bear that risk. So we spent a lot of time raising that funding. What happened? How did we get there? We raised 14-year money in the end. A lot of it came from African Development Bank. We managed to raise 14-year funding from African Development Bank after a lot of work and a lot of sweat and a lot of tears. But eventually they saw the need to do that, and we came up with a swap structure, which was quite innovative at the time, because the deal actually had a government guarantee, and the government guarantee swap structure was fungible with the bonds out there, and we came up with a structure that actually took that obligation and put it back into, from a AFDB perspective, back into government. So the government risk. The second thing we did was the local banks. When we started the transaction in 2004, they would not go for infrastructure projects more than 5 years. And then there was the consolidation. There were over 100 banks when we started off the transaction. The financial markets was not very deep. Those banks went through consolidation. It came down to about 20 banks that helped the market, because it meant that banks were sitting on a lot more capital and needed to be deployed. And they started going longer. They went to 7 years. We put in mini perms, still didn't work. Eventually, we got them to 12 years after going through a painful 2-year experience explaining what we're actually looking at and what type of risk they're actually taking. So there was a differentiation between the tenors on the one side from the DFIs, and there we got Standard Bank also to provide a 14-year facility, and the local banks to provide a shorter 12-year facility. But the point is, when you have these transactions, if your local currency earnings are in the projects, you have to, and as a financial advisor, I'll tell you, have to get your funding and cost matched in local currency.
On the currency issue, I'd have to agree. Where possible, we should always match. We also have to be realistic, though. The capital markets are not that deep in many of our markets, so even if we did want to issue local currency bonds, it's sometimes a challenge. If I give you an example, for PTA Bank, we issued a bond earlier this year, a shilling bond in Tanzania, but this took us over a year to bring to market, and it was only $20 million equivalent of Tanzanian shillings, but was the largest issue in the Tanzanian market for the last 3 years. $20 million is a drop in the ocean for most infrastructure projects. And it actually happened that this was money we were then using, interestingly enough, to refinance ourselves, because the transaction had been done 2 years before, and we couldn't wait for the market to be ready for the bond for us to fund the project. So we had our treasury folks do their own gymnastics, and 2 years prior, we were able to actually invest in one of the local utilities to be able to do that. So it's a challenge, but we say there's business to be done out there, and that's why we're all about solutions. I think another very good point is around who are the other partners we can bring to the table. Yes, we are a DFI, and as such, we actually are, part of our role is to crowd in funding, right? So we will partner with the likes of KCB, of course, we'll partner with the net banks and others. And where possible, for every transaction, we do try to ensure that there is a local bank in place. One, to try and match a little bit the currency issue, but also as part of crowding in and having somebody on the ground who is able to see what's happening. We are located in 4 different countries. Nairobi is one of our regional offices. Bujumbura is actually our head office. We have an office in Mauritius and one in Harare. But we do business in 19 countries. When we have the local partners, they're able to see what's happening more real time. Yes, we get reports, we travel from time to time, but there's that risk sharing. It's not just risk sharing from a financial perspective in terms of a piece of the pie, but also risk sharing from the reporting side. On the maintenance, it's funny you asked that, because I was having a conversation over lunch with a former colleague on the very same thing, to say it's important when we're looking at investments, especially in infrastructure, that we don't just get carried away with what will it take to put this road in place, or what will it take to put this hospital in place, but talk about what will it take to maintain this for the next 20, 30 years. And so as bankers, part of our responsibility is to actually factor that in as we're putting together the funding package. So for many of us, we will build our own financial models, and within that, we don't just look at the CapEx up front, but obviously the CapEx to maintain over the years. So that's something I'd put a plug there, because usually we're all very optimistic. I don't know, best in class, and it'll last for 15, 20 years. Yeah, but with everything, it does require maintenance.
We do believe that one of the competitive advantages that we bring to the table is to think about the life cycle of these various projects. Relating to that, of course, but I think we're all specialists in the room, is trying to understand really what the government motivation is about with regards to these PPPs. my basic premise, and I remind others of this all the time, PPP doesn't mean private party pays. Okay, there has to be but unfortunately a lot of people do believe that this is the case, even some of their advisors. John, I don't mean you, but anyways, but we do look at that. And so we would like to take, for example, the opportunity to value engineer things. Let's put down a concrete pavement structure instead of an asphalt one, assuming it can be done. And then we can only resurface 1 or 2 times, okay, over the life cycle versus resurfacing every other year. There is something, though, that Ziad touched about on the currency side of things, and it's something that we're actually starting to do as a developer worldwide. And that is, even if the local markets are a little shallow, okay, we do try to promote the idea of refinancing risk. Okay, so we will come up with mini-perm solutions, okay, parking the risk of the refinance post-construction to the government, or at least maybe having some sort of sharing, both in the downside as well as the upside. Traditionally, our model is, the banks don't like this, but it's true, and that is once construction has been completed and you have 1 or 2 years of operation, you can refinance that the construction risk has evaporated. So that is something that we are pushing ourselves on. It's something we hope does develop going forward, because we know we can't get 15, 18-year local money with or without the supports of the DFIs and whatnot.
Due to foreign exchange, and just relating it back to this morning, if I may, just I think Nick Allen mentioned in passing that on foreign exchange risk, looking to do a natural hedge through the payment mechanism so that there is payment effectively equivalent to foreign currency, so dollar-based probably, so that there is a natural hedge there to allow, to enable foreign currency borrowings in a more efficient manner with the natural facilitation there. So that is being structured into the projects which were being talked about this morning, and should make it more efficient and more bankable.
You have everything from those who are willing to take the sovereign risk to those who are willing to take even the completion risk. I'm sure we've all heard on the geothermal side that there are those who are willing to take the risk that the holes are running dry. So it really comes down to structuring the best, we'll call it the best marriage. It might have more than 2 people getting married, but just to see who is best placed to take the risks at various points in time. Obviously, Jim, as bankers who are taking the heavy load up front, we're not excited about refinancing as an opportunity or as an option, but we will factor that into our structures. And we actually do see more and more commercial banks come into some of our transactions and either try or successfully manage to refinance them once we've taken out the completion risk.
The issue of tapping all the sources of local currency funding. If you look at long-term infrastructure projects, PPPs, 30-year concessions, very long life cycle, has assets that last a long time if they are properly maintained, obviously, built properly and maintained. Those really speak to a particular instrument or particular class of in debt investor, and that's the capital markets, which within Kenya specifically has got a capital market that is active, but yet untapped for infrastructure funding. I think whilst and that is the answer really to long-term infrastructure development. In South Africa, I'll give you an example of what happened there. In the first toll roads in 1994, some of the institutions came in on board. They came in on board on the deals after a lot of work. They came in with small tickets. Eventually understood what project finance is because they came alongside the banks. Fast forward 20 years, the same institutions now have become the largest lenders to the IPPs in South Africa. And how did they get there? It did not just happen. There was a lot of effort put in by the local institutions, the local banks, who actually understood that if they don't interact with the capital market players, the institutions, the banks cannot fund all of these long-term projects by themselves. They have to have an outlet for the long-term funding, and that is in the institutional market. So the banks really play the role of getting the deals to financial close, and then recycling their capital on new deals as they come in, offloading that refinancing risk post-construction to the capital markets and institutional funders. A lot of work was done in the renewables program in South Africa by going and educating the asset managers on the new class of asset that came to market. We've got a great opportunity with all of these road PPPs coming to market, where these long-term assets that the institutional market can put on to match their long-term liabilities. But besides the regulatory CMA changes and the RBA changes, an effort has to be taken either by the local financing institutions or the bidders and or government as well. So just like the transaction advisors have been engaging with the DFIs, I would recommend and suggest that they also engage just with a little more vigor the asset managers and the capital market participants in educating them on this new class of asset that's coming in. Because long term, you want those participants to be the biggest takers of these long-term annuity assets.
We read the agreements as a lender beforehand and ensure that, again, it comes down to risk. Who is best placed to take on the different types of risk? So if we have an EPC contractor who is different from the O&M, what we will do is in the EPC contract, the agreement itself, make sure there are penalties and or bonuses for both completion on time, on budget, but also the quality. And the same thing on the O&M. At the same time, what we do specifically as PTA Bank is we make sure that we have a lender's technical advisor who is usually an expert in that sector, and they will be part of our due diligence team up front, but also part of the portfolio management team throughout the life of the transaction. But oftentimes, you're very right. When we don't pay attention and allocate the risk and make it real financially, then we do get into a lot of trouble. So long as we feel that the agreements have been correctly structured to ensure that also we don't have transfer issues and arm's length for both sides of that transaction. If there are the O&M and the EPC, we'd want to make sure that we do still cover those risks. We don't have an issue if it's the same person or the same entity doing it, so long as they actually have that in-house capacity to do it. But also, we have penalties regardless for both the EPC section and the O&M section. Would you care to share your experiences in the sector? Our understanding was this was supposed to focus mainly on transport, but if you are in other parts of infrastructure, I think it would be interesting to hear your experiences, not just in Kenya, but in other countries.
With regards to the enabling legislation and regulatory framework, we did not have any of that 10 years ago when we set out to do our Nairobi concession here. I'm sure there are a few of you have a little bit more recent experience on the annuity program and things like that. So the land issue is going to continue to haunt us. I have to say I took a lot of takeaway points from yesterday's discussion from a legal point of view with regards to land acquisition. I don't necessarily know if I understood everything or even anything, but the point is it's very, very foggy still. There's no clarity on that. And it goes without saying, from whether it's a bankability or just a pure legal point of view, that the lack of the land is going to be the deal breaker here, as it has been all over the world.
One of the key partners, obviously, in a lot of the heavy infrastructure is the public sector. And what we're seeing and we're encouraged by is in a number of markets, if I look at East Africa as a starting point, we're actually starting to see standardization, not just of processes, but even legal documentation whether it's in the power sector, on the PPAs, some of the concessions, at least the main terms and conditions, are being standardized, which removes that element of uncertainty, but also can quicken the process for both the developers and also the funders. I'm just wondering, Ziad, what's your experience on that?
I'm a firm believer in standardizing processes, especially if you want to have repeat business. It just helps negotiation. It shortens the time span to get to financial close. And we saw this playing out very nicely in South Africa, where we were in 1994 with the first concession agreement for the N4 Maputo toll road, and we progressed through different versions of what the PPP agreement looked like up to now, where the IPPs in South Africa in the renewable space have all got concession agreements that is bankable and cannot be changed. So government issues the IPP, the PPA document and the implementation agreement after having gone through years of getting it bankable, and the condition for a bid is that you cannot change the PPA and the implementation agreement. So everything becomes standardized. And in that way, there's now more than, how many projects, Hussein, help me out here? There's about,
for the latest round 4C, there were about 100 bids submitted.
so 100 bids submitted. Deals closed have been in the order of $250 billion worth, or rands worth of deals. So you can't get there immediately, and we understand that. 100 projects bid in one round. Bids, yes. So closed projects are around 57, if I think correctly. I speak under correction, but it's in the 50s. But again, you can't get there overnight. It took a long time to get there, but I think the learnings is one of get a few deals into the market. The first few deals are not going to be the best deals from a risk allocation perspective, but that will come as people get familiar with the transaction, people understand what they're dealing with, what instruments you're dealing with from the financing side, what risks are being taken from the government side, and then move towards a position where it actually works for everyone, and the private sector can say, this document I can accept as bankable, I do not need to change it, and the only thing they need to then do is bid technically what can be done, and financially what can be structured. And in that way, you attract the foreign capital quite quickly.
Number one, energy is different than infrastructure, transport, because it's replicable. The projects are, technology-wise identical almost. Location is less important, even for renewables. But nevertheless, and this is not an energy section, countries should be doing what we have been doing in South Africa, which was, number one, clearly first thing I would like to say, signing a few deals and then implementing them. Building projects is the best advertisement you can do for the investment environment in your country. There's no, and I don't know why that is not understood in this part of the world so often as we see and suffer from. But for the renewables program, I think the key features that made it successful were there was scale. So there was the opportunity to have many projects in one bidding round and create a competitive environment. And secondly, I thought it was the having different rounds. When the program was initially announced, there were 3 rounds of biddings, which made it very attractive to invest into the feasibility of each of the projects and force the bidders to put good projects forward. And they knew if I lose in the first round, I might win in the second, I might win in the third. It didn't work out that way for many, but that was a sensible commercial view of the opportunity, and that attracted a lot of people. And the third thing was the requirement to line up financing. So there was this, you know this much better. You were involved in it as well as I was on the legal side. But that pushed people to really structure their projects right. And that's why it took so long to get the first round right and the documents right on it. But that really kind of like canceled out all the you know, the hazardeurs, the risk takers, the small companies that are traveling this part of the world, meeting with ministries, wasting everybody's time by promising they will do something without having the funding to do it. And I thought these three components, so scale, rounds, so multiple opportunities to win, and requirement to provide financing, that was quite critical. I don't know if you disagree, but if we could do this at least in energy in other countries, Uganda, Tanzania probably have enough scale, Ethiopia for sure, wouldn't work in Rwanda, too small, but could work easily in Mozambique. So this would be kind of like, you know, the solution. Sorry for the long.
If you want to attract investment into a country, you want to attract permanent capital into a country, launch a program, because foreign investors, and maybe Jim can expand on this here, foreign investors don't want to come here and do a one-hit wonder and lose. You want to come here and establish permanency. And if you have a program, and that's exactly what happened in South Africa, because the government came out and said, we're gonna do 6,500 megawatts over X number of years. And then what they did was they limited each round to only 1,000 megawatts, and they saw the demand, but they didn't increase it by another 5,000 in the next round. They limited it, and that caused the competition and the pricing to come down and brought the market to where it is now, where it's very competitive. And that became a win-win, because you had more people coming in and seeing deals in the market, a program, they set up permanent offices, skills transfer has happened, factories have been, and industry has developed around that program. And what we've got here is we have a program that was put up. There are a whole lot of PPPs coming. And to develop the market, not just for Kenya, but regionally, if there's sight, and again, it's difficult doing one deal in one country with one government because there are multiple departments. Doing it in 2 or 3 countries is even more difficult, but some coordination could happen to say that there is an East African program for these type of roads. And in that way, a regional standardization, I know I'm complicating things here, but then you have foreign investors coming in and saying, we're not just here for 3 projects or 4 projects in Kenya, we're here for East Africa, we establish permanent base, and we see deal flow happening. And that communication really attracts the not just the equity investors, but the debt market as well becomes more deeper and developed.
As I mentioned, we're a European-based construction group company. 70% of our turnover is made in only 3 countries. Quite a few people ask, what happened? Why did you leave Kenya? You were here a long time ago. What happened? And I can waste even more of your time and a lot of your time by explaining what happened, with the Chinese coming in, taking market share away. We were awarded €1 billion at the time of work in Libya. We took 200 Kenyans with us and brought all 200 Kenyans back with us after my American brothers and sisters started to bomb the place. But anyways, that's another story. But having said that, they ask, well, where else do you work and whatnot? We set up and we won a project last year of all places in Colombia. Okay, and again, all of your Colombia, that's Escobar, narco, that's cocaine stuff and whatnot. They have a robust pipeline, okay? 4th generation is what it's called. They've already done concessions in the past. They're awarding 22 concession projects, all right? Over $20 billion of total investment, all right? Technically challenging projects, okay? Tunnels, this hilly terrain project that I understand up to Nakuru. This is exactly what gets us very excited. We don't want these special appearances anymore where we come in. My boss has enough AA Kenyan coffee. He wants more out of my visits here. And so we want to see the sustainable pipelines. This is why we're excited about Kenya. This is why, hopefully, Beatrice, why things will work out in Uganda with the Kampala Jinga. That's the first, hopefully, of many projects that will follow. But I do believe, and it gets back also to what Alex mentioned, that is, let's just start with a deal, please. We don't need to perfect everything. Just start with a deal. And as Ziad also mentioned, put the country on with the lighthouse on the investment radar screen. So,
when you talk of construction within infrastructure, you're talking about political risk in any event. there are various mechanisms to overcome that. What you ultimately need to have is one, investment will come in if the political risk can be mitigated. You can never get rid of political risk. You can only mitigate political risk. The financing community, and really I'm only going to speak financing, and you can add to that as well. The finance community has come up with various structures, but they are qualitative and quantitative mitigants. The qualitative one is involving good partners on the ground. Local community involvement, very important, especially when you are working on the ground and constructing something. Early on, and you know, there are many examples in Kenya, I'm not going to repeat that, or else we'll just go on to another track here. Local community involvement, the right partners involved early on. You can't just do a project, fly in, fly out. You have to have local participation. There's also, in order to mitigate some of and that's localized political risk. The government political risk, the quantitative measures are put in. There are various insurances that can be taken out, and everyone knows about political risk insurance. It's mentioned that through export credit financing instruments that provides you with that type of political risk cover. The point I want to make is that there is no country in the world that doesn't have political risk. It's the level of political risk that needs mitigation.
What it comes down to, political risk is one of the risks that you have to look at in every investment. And I liked how you broke it down, Ziad. It comes from different levels. It's not just about change of government. It's not just about if there is security or not, physical security in an area. It is also about constituents and whether or not they're happy that that transaction is happening, that road is going through their home or their homestead. So what do we do about that? We assess the risk. It's different for every transaction. And then we allocate the risk to the party that's best placed to manage it. So if we feel political risk of a certain level is best handled by national government, that's where we'll park it. If we believe it's best managed by another entity, we will park it there. But then we need to take it a step further. It's not enough to just allocate the risk. You need to align incentives. So how do we do that? There are many creative ways. Since this is being recorded and it's not Chatham House rules, we won't go into those creative ways of doing that, but you make it quite costly for the various parties who are best placed to manage that risk, not to manage it effectively, or you incentivize them to manage it effectively so that they get even more benefits. So it's just about risk assessment, alignment of incentives when you're allocating the risk to the best party that's involved. That said, if you still don't have appetite, there are entities that do this for a living, the likes of MIGA of the World Bank, and of course the likes of ATI, the Africa Trade Insurance. And there are other entities, actually commercial entities, that are willing to take political risk in a number of countries, including those that are, we'll call them post-conflict or midst conflict if you happen to find yourself in those markets.
Now, in the concession agreement, penalties will affect both the financier and the EPC contractor, who might be part of the concession anyway. Now, in determining how the performance standards are set and the financial penalties or the quantums or formulas set in there. From a financier perspective, how would you look at those? Would you say that's just some discussion point between the concessionaire or the contractor with the contracting party, or would you as financiers also step in to look at those formulas and penalties and determine what is the best way? Because this is the first time you're doing such projects in this part of the world in some sense. So there's no, historical data to look at. You could look at European countries, the UK, etc., but are those representative for projects in Kenya, for example?
What you have is a situation of, again, with project finance, and you've heard this before, is that the risk is passed on to the party best able to manage it. With penalties, we've spent many years on different concessions, where there's road, or accommodation, or other type of projects. where performance needs to be evaluated. From a concessionaire perspective, and when I advise the concession company, we need to protect the concession company as much as possible, obviously not for their own fault. What happens there is that the typical formula, and we can go into a lot of detail afterwards, the typical formula is that the party that is cause of the non-performance should feel the pain. And that pain should be something that causes them to perform again. But to the extent that performance becomes persistent, then that pain needs to leads to default. So it's in that realms that the negotiation happens. And what happens then from a lender's perspective, you don't want to cause hair trigger defaults because the pain comes too soon. Because a lender is incentivized to push the pain to a point where the performance actually starts happening, and you set your default triggers accordingly, because it's in no one's interest when there's a default. It is not in the concession company's interest, it is not in the shareholders' interest, it's not in the lender's interest, and it certainly isn't in the government's interest as well. So that doesn't mean that you don't reach default. Persistent breaches should always be a default, and that's sacrosanct. However, when there's a default, remember, if a project is terminated, yes, there'll be loss suffered by the shareholders. There'll be loss suffered by the operator to the extent it's in operating period. And there'll be loss suffered by the lenders. But also, government then has to make a payment, which is a big ask again from the fiscus. So that situation should have sufficient triggers during the period of default up to persistence, and then default occurs. It's a long answer, but again, like I say, each deal is different. There are various precedents, not just outside of Africa, but within Africa, within South Africa, within PPPs that have been done in the region. We can find those precedents and use that for the specific projects that you're dealing with.
As much as we become lawyers, we also become developers, right? As long-term investors, and that's what we look at ourselves as, is we are your partner for, say, 10, 12 years. And we can't afford to just take whatever we get, keep our fingers crossed and go to church every day and hope for the best. So from a very early stage, we will look at the contracts, not just from an enforceability perspective, but also to see, is this concession financially viable? So we will get to that extent, not least because most times we have step-in rights as lenders. So if something does go wrong, we could find ourselves becoming the concession, excuse me, taking the place of the concession owner. So it's important for us to know that. If I give an example without mentioning names, we have in the power sector where take or pay, PPA, it's very clear, very tight. We're all very happy about it. However, there was a little loophole that we had not foreseen, which was not about the energy generation and then you pay us regardless. It was actually about the transmission side, which was outside the control of the company that we were investing in. And actually the off-taker did not pay us because they said, well, the transmission line wasn't there. So nice that you actually generated it, but you didn't get it on grid for us to be able to pay. It's an extreme example. We learned to be micro-detailed from there, but also from that government's perspective, by the time we were looking at the next investment with the same promoter, that government had also closed that loophole and was able to actually take responsibility for the transmission side because that was within their mandate. But yes, we look at it very closely and we don't just look, we will advise, and at sometimes we will have it as a condition that the formula is changed to something that we feel is financially viable.
We want the lenders to be interested. And so that drives towards there being some money at risk, particularly on contractor default, because we need the lenders to be be undertaking their element, getting their due diligence, both technical, legal, and everything else, that they are interested throughout the process and fully involved. That's part of the benefit through the PPP, that you are getting this level of scrutiny, that they're looking to ensure that there is a quality asset. And I think if you bring this back to the road sector, I think it's fair to say that the quality of maintenance that we've seen in the country here has not been up to standard. We need to change the mindset so that what is being delivered is a quality asset which lasts throughout the life of the asset and is maintained throughout the life of the asset. And so it's got to be that that quality is incentivized through the payment mechanism, and that the lenders are fully involved for at least the period in which they are participating and still lending money, and that delivers what the general public requires.
It's our time to eat. Basically is in direct connection to corruption, where infrastructure projects with such huge amounts of investments are introduced, everybody flocks. How have you managed to navigate through those murky waters of corruption, and what are some of the systems that we can put in place so that all these amazing projects are not actually suffocated under this cover of corruption?
A fair playing field is in the realm of the concessions and PPPs. I don't want to go so far as to say that other projects that are tendered in different ways are maybe more susceptible to strange things happening, but the experience is, especially over the past several years in some of the developing countries we're working, is that you do have price dumping by the competition. We don't understand how people can do this, but it does happen. The advantage, I think, in the way that a number of these concessions are now being set up, this is one of the growing trends we're starting to see, is there is institutional capacity building, as was mentioned, quite a bit of which is supported by the World Bank and by other multilateral and regional developing organizations. The point is these projects are under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of eyes. Of course, part of the problem is the timeline as a whole. This is something that Engineer Kamau has also told me. Yes, he knows things are taking a long time. He's also not very excited about that, but he also wants to avoid a situation where the Daily Nation is coming up with strange news reports about irregularities and things like that. So he wants to be extra careful. As an organization, what we experience now also worldwide is, there's literally zero tolerance. If we get something wrong on a project in South America, we automatically go on the list, not only of the Inter-American Development Bank, but we're on the list of the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Asian Development Bank, and most likely with time, as we want to do more things here, the African Development Bank. So again, we're very, very careful about this. Quite a bit of our business is funded one way or the other by the multilaterals. We're just now completing the bus rapid transit in Tanzania, which is a World Bank funded project. And so you can appreciate some of the compliance issues and things like that. It is an issue out there from a developer's construction point of view. We do take it though very, very seriously. And there are also quite a few markets and countries, which I don't want to name, that we just don't go to because we've been confronted with these open hand policies. And people who have strange expectations thinking that because I work for a German-Austrian company, I can source them a car very cheaply, and a nice car. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
It's a lovely question to have at this time of day and with this panel. All I can say as a starting point, though, as a development financial institution, a rule of thumb for many of us is to ask ourselves, if tomorrow this transaction, this person, was to be on the headlines with such and such funded by PTA Bank, could we live with that, right? So if that's our starting point, then you should understand that we do our due diligence quite thoroughly. So to weed out the chancers, for instance, we'll let them know very early on. Our due diligence process includes understanding how you got your concession or your license. And we will do the work. And if there's any inappropriate behavior, then we won't touch it. We will go as far as to ask if you are a developer who's fortunate enough to have the personal wealth to invest $50, $100 million in a transaction, we will go as far as to find out where you originally got that 100, right? So it immediately takes off, let's say, out of the running, a number of less sophisticated people. I'm not saying those who have 100 million and are very sophisticated can't get through. That then we do our next level of due diligence in environmental and social side. So making sure that it's willing buyer, willing seller, wherever there are land issues involved. We also make it very clear in our terms and conditions, for instance, how procurement should be done to make sure that we do have arm's length transactions and somebody's not just getting their cousin, their sister, who is not necessarily qualified to do a certain element, whether it's the O&M or EPC, et cetera. So it's upfront due diligence on who we're working with. We take the know your customer that I think many of us are used to from our commercial banks. We take it to the next degree, not least because we ourselves do partner with the very same ones that you mentioned, Jim, in Europe, in Asia, in the US, and so have to make sure that our partners are clean beyond not just being on some of these databases.
PPPs are more suited to attracting the likes of Strabag and other institutions. The reason for that is because of the scrutiny in the tender process. There is no other procurement process that I'm aware of where you have so many parties looking at what is being tendered. Well, actually, no, so many parties looking at what is first tendered out and then what is received on tender. The fact that you've got so many eyes, and I'm using your quote, on the process, that does mitigate a lot of that the corruption that goes in awarding of a tender. Now, again, you know, the point has to be made is that these PPP processes do take a lot of time because you have more people involved, you have more resources involved. That in itself is a disincentive for any nefarious type of actions that could arise. The second thing is they are really big projects that will involve big organizations within the country. And those institutions, be it banks or other equity investors, put another level of due diligence onto the process as well, ensuring the right partners are chosen, ensuring that what is being tendered can actually be delivered. And in that way, you're actually choosing the right people to do the job as opposed to just choosing someone who has managed to get the job by whatever means. So the due diligence, the fact that so many people are involved, the banks that have a second level of scrutiny because they also hire their own advisors to look at the process, the lawyers involved, and usually when there's a usually the lawyers have to sign off on first-time deals that come to market on has the process been fulfilled according to the law. So again, in summary, it is the fact that it's a more drawn-out process with a lot more eyes on it that allows us to navigate through that maze to get the process clean.
One of the key lessons that we like to repeat, and that is we need competent government counterparts that are willing and able to make decisions and that they don't go on paralysis mode because they're so afraid about making the decision today that they might be held accountable for in 20 years' time. This is just the nature of bureaucrats sometimes, very little incentives. Quite a bit of the time we look as kind of a must-have, somebody within the awarding authority who is the political champion, somebody who has the courage to push the projects forward and make very tough decisions. and not allow things just to be held up for the lights of, I don't know, better things to do rather than make a decision today.
Just somebody who can contribute something on how we can make our transport sector better.
Working in this region, as you all do, one of the biggest struggles is prioritization. There is a huge lack of capacity within ministries. There is, I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I always working for governments a lot. I'm surprised that governments, are reluctant to appoint external advisors, but when they deal with the investors, Strabag, I don't know how many lawyers Strabag has, but you have more than 100. But still, when you do a project anywhere in the world, you have external counsel. I don't know how many finance advisors you have, but when you do a project, you will have external advisors. The governments never do. The first year and a half for the initiation of a project, I mean, the PPP tenders is different often, but on unsolicited bids and even in the PPP tenders, they say, oh, well, we have one guy that's going to help us, and let's just try to move forward without. So I think there is a lack of capacity, which is natural because we're in a development phase. But what is even worse is there is a lack of prioritization. If you don't have enough capacity and then you don't prioritize, you won't get anything done. And I think that is one of the things that we must do better in this part of the world. And I was happy to see that you're doing that. And then, as it was mentioned earlier, having a roadmap, having a roadshow. So all these type of things to maximize the limited capacity that you have. If the Kenyan government can do that sector by sector, and then cross exchange that capacity in Attorney General's office, Ministry of Finance, and so forth, because we also see often the silos. Again, working with government, so you have people from different ministries do one deal, and they do it well or not so well. But regardless, similar deal, similar sector, you have to deal with totally different people next time around because another group of people want to do this now. And that's not very efficient. So all about efficiency, planning, and making best use of capacity. That's really critical, I believe.
Standardization over time, right? Which would actually help, as you say, from transaction to transaction and sector to sector. And the reason that came to mind is I have a situation right now where we're spending, I think, 9 months with the Attorney General's office of one of our countries in which we're working on literally 4 clauses for 9 months. In principle, we're on the same page. It's now the wording around that. And we're hoping that that will actually lead to a document, or at least language around certain clauses that can be applied to other transactions, not just in that sector, but across the infrastructure space.
Been intimately involved throughout the process. And institutionally going forward, through these projects, the contracting authorities have to set up what's called a PPP Node, so that it's not just the project development team of the individual project, but there is a group of people who have experience of PPP within that organization, so that you can carry that forward through. And that's enshrined within the PPP Act of Kenya, so that there is this carry forward of institutional capacity into future projects. Now, that's as it's set up in law. Yes, I fully accept that I've seen many countries where you've had the way that civil service works is that you move on from job to job to job. That's a danger, and that's something that we need to guard against, that when you get capacity, the knowledge of PPP, that is used for future projects, not just for lost, because for promotion you have to go and do something else.
Respond to that from my personal experience. When I joined KCB 8 years ago, I came from Standard Chartered Bank. And obviously, changing from an international bank to a local bank was quite challenging, very different environment. So from a KCB perspective, yes, we've come a long way, but there are certainly things that we haven't quite come up to speed with. And I guess exposure from private sector lending to government business has been a completely different ballgame. The money may or may not be there, and you've already committed to your customers or contractors or corporates for whatever infrastructure project you're talking about. So, learning very quickly to be flexible enough to look at a balance sheet and return on investment scenario in the long run rather than on a year-to-year basis, and having to explain to your shareholders for that particular year, why do you still have this debt sitting on your books that doesn't look like it's been factored on any line in government vote to pay it off? So that has been different from the international banking perspective. However, we have been fortunate to partner very closely with government to learn how to do things differently, quickly, with as much flexibility as possible. And KCB not being a dollarized bank, coming up with innovative ways to cater for both sides of the business. Because typically in this country, we are not Nigeria, we don't have a dollar income from oil or anything like that. And our dollar incomes are not at the level that they should be. And yet we consume so much in terms of capital expenditure in a foreign currency. So that has been a good learning. I guess we move along and learn as quickly as possible how to fit in. I personally would like to see a PTA, ADB kind of sharing of or exposure to learning financing structures which are unique to government-related projects or PPPs, which is something we don't have at KCB. As on top of that, when we get in management trainees from the local universities, they're not up to speed at all in terms of technical experience on the projects or financial experience or legal experience. What I would like to see is the Ministry of Education, when they're coming up with this revamped system of education, for it to be, yes, Mogo Kefati said it would be tied to Vision 2030. I just don't see, maybe the gentleman from the university can tell us exactly how he has tied that to Vision 2030. So all round, there are definitely things that we need to learn, and we're not shy to say we don't know the PPP side of financing as well as we should, but we've been, I believe, good partners to the businesses here locally and in the region.
What is it that the university should inculcate in the students to help them adapt? Yeah, is the attitude of confidence and willingness to learn. I was sharing with my colleague, I can't remember who he was yesterday, that I was taken through the process of assembling one PC in about 3 hours, and I took the job of completing the remaining 61s. But how many organizations are willing to give these graduates opportunity to learn? Many times we have what we call industrial attachments, but the kind of narrative we hear when our students come back after that industrial attachment period is that one has either been just a tea girl or an errand boy. So you as organizations need also to help us that when these students are sent to you, please put them where they can learn. They're very good. Your attitude towards them matters. I'm a living example. When I finished assembling 60 PCs, I was called back for a master's program. That's within a period of 1 month. But you can believe me, while I was here in Nairobi doing masters, there was a lot more I was doing for the university and for the industry. Why? Because one organization was kind enough to teach me what I was not taught in the university. Thank you.
What we can take away is within the next few weeks, each one of the banks will have a better understanding of what this means.
I mean, any local other companies you might have heard of 20, 30% interests, and you wouldn't be surprised. This helps you from a private sector perspective, and I think that will help growth and tame any future incidents like, Imperial Bank or the likes.
From a corporate banking perspective, they certainly will be it'll be very streamlined, very standardized, and therefore the partnerships that we have with our customers will become a little bit more real in terms of, this hopping across many banks for the same kind of service will not happen. So we are going to get efficiencies. So I see possibilities and opportunities. For me, I think cause for concern in the industry generally is the tier 3 banks, where cost of running the business is quite high, and so therefore the cost of giving out loans and advances is also quite high, in the 20% and above. Therein lies the challenge. So I don't think the tier 1 banks have that much of an issue in terms of making adjustments, both in caps and collars for deposit interest. But certainly the playing field may change for tier 2, tier 3 banks drastically, or a little bit more drastically. And we can only hope that with the regulator who is currently in the picture, a lot of thought process will be put behind making sure that we stabilize the industry as much as possible to transfer that perceived benefit to good businesses and good borrowers who have in the past maybe not made as much progress because of taking the entire industry outlook for each individual application, as it were. So it would be, I think, for me, something positive in the corporate space.
We must come to a close. I think the most important thing that I've taken away from here is that let's see more deals.
To those of you who have persevered with us for the full 2 hours, it has actually in the end been quite a lively discussion. I would say my parting thoughts, one is to once again say we're open for business. The opportunities are out there. We're about structuring solutions. We work in interesting markets, for lack of a better phrase, and that there are opportunities for various stakeholders in these transactions. And I go away from this with the knowledge that they are partners, not just in the local environment, but partners who can share experiences from various markets.
So we're encouraged. We have perseverance. I still have a little bit of dark hair to become gray hair, so we're in for the long road, but thank you.
Pause to our panelists. You may kindly have your seats. Parting shots were very clear. Let's seal more deals. And we're open for business. And of course, it's evolution, not revolution. It was an honor serving you today as we focused on the transport sector. And please pardon me for those who will be traveling. I hope that all of us will be caught in some bit of traffic so that we will strive to find a solution before we are all turned into jam. Ladies and gentlemen, it was an honor once again. My name is Johnson Mwakazi. All the best. Thank you so much indeed.